بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. بخير بن جاري كتير. Welcome again. Now I'm going to be talking about the literary movements from a Kurdish standpoint. This is page 17, the grade 11 Kurdish textbook, and it is a topic that's going to be brought back in exams, and it's a very important topic for you to know. So let's get started. Rebazi Romanticism, the Romance movement in literature, sometimes called Romanticism movement, also sometimes attributed to modernism. كم جار وشيء رومانسیزم دبیستین شتی خودی و خیالی و سوز و شیدابونی سروشت و خوشویستی و شوێنەواری و کۆنمان بە بیر دەدات. When you first hear the word romance, you think of the traditionally, romantic quote-unquote things, like, for example, imagination, love, شیدابونی سروشت, the loving of nature, خوشویستی شوێنەواری کۆن, or like loving old, architecture, all of these things that are usually attributed to romance. But the romance movement, as a literary it's a hard word, literary movement, is a different thing. Of course, it attributes the same traits, but when we look at it as a movement, we have to put other factors into place. Like, ڕێبازی ڕۆمانسیزم لە ئەوروپا نزیکەی سەدە و نیوێک دوای دەرکەوتنی ڕێبازی کلاسیزم سەری هەڵدا. The literary movement of Romanticism in Europe appeared about سەدە و نیوێک, or a century and a half after the appearance of the classicism, or like classical literary movement. ئەم ڕێبازە نوێیە شۆڕشێک بوو دژی دەستور و بنەمای دەقڕەدەیانی classicism. This movement, this Romanticism movement, was a shorish, meaning was a revolt against the traditions and the practices that the classical movement brought in. For example, the classical movement is very, it uses hard, difficult words to understand. Like if you've ever read a classical Kurdish poem, it's very hard to understand. Romanticism came to destroy that, came to set up new rules and new foundations. And so, بەهەمان شێوە شۆڕشێک بوو بۆ ڕزگارکردنی ئەدەب و هونەر لەژێر دەسەڵاتی داهەسەپاوی ئەدەبی گریکی و لاتینی کۆن. At the same time, it was an attack, or was a revolt for freeing literature and art from the strong, forceful influence of Greek and Latin, like old Latin literature. Dasapau means forced influence. It's influence, but a very big influence, kind of like a big boot that crushes anything under it. And so that was the idea of Greek and Latin literature at the time. It was unbreakable, but Romanticism came to break that. ڕێبازی ڕۆمانسیزم ئازاکردنەوەی حەز و خۆلیا و ڕەهاکردنی سۆزی مرۆڤە، کردنەوەی جیهانی بێسنووری سۆز و گیانە لە بەرهەمی ئەدەبی و هونەریدا. ڕێبازی Romanticism, the Romanticism movement, was freeing حەز و خۆلیا, was freeing feelings, emotions, love و ڕەهاکردنی سۆزی مرۆڤە, and the exercising human love or human emotions. کردنەوەی جیهانی بێسنووری سۆز و گیانە لە بەرهەمی ئەدەبی و هونەریدا. It was opening this world, this borderless world of love and emotion in the form of literary and artistic works. And so right after this, we enter into سەرچاوەی زمانەوانی Romanticism, or the etymology of Romanticism. What does Romanticism mean? There's two opinions we have to keep in mind. The first opinion is that وشي Romanticism لوشي Romaniosەوە هاتووە. The first opinion states that Romanticism came from Romanios, or the word Romanios. Romaniosiش بۆ زمانانە دەگوترێت کە لە زمانە لاتینەکان پەیدا بوونە و لە سەدەکانی ناوەڕاستدا بەزمانی ڕەمەکی دادەنرا. And so this opinion states that Romanticism came from Romanios, which was called, Romanios was, describing the languages that were sourced from Latin, from the language of Latin. These languages that came from Latin were called the Romanios languages. And so one of the opinions is that this Romanios then evolved into Romanticism. Because you know how Romanticism came to destroy the Old Latin. And so these languages are all Romanios coming from Latin to destroy Latin. لسرەتای چاقی بوژانەوەی ڕەنەسانسیشدا وردە بوونە زمانی نووسین و جێگەی زمانی لاتینیەوە گرتووە. This opinion also states that in the beginning of the Renaissance, or چاقی بوژانەوە, وردە, slowly but surely, they became the written language, and they held the language that the Latin language once held. And so مەبەستی ڕۆمانسیزمیەکان لە هەڵبژاردننی ئەم وشایەدا ئەوە بوو کە مێژوو و ئەدەب و کولتوری نەتەوایەتی خۆیان لە گریک و لاتینیەوە جیا بکەنەوە. And so they say that these people that established the movement of Renaissance, of course I'm by the way talking about here, it says that the intention of these people that started this literary movement was to establish themselves apart from the Latin and the Greeks, by establishing themselves as an independent literary movement and an independent people. There's this other opinion that says Romanticism came from the more direct meaning of romance, which in the Middle Ages was used for, imaginary stories. Basically, these romance was, called to imaginary stories, and these like old hero stories like Swarchaki Bakadahat and so on. Romance پەیوەندی بە چینی خانەدان ئەریستۆکراتەوە هەبوو، بەڵام زمانەکانی سادە و ساکار بوو، زمانی میلەت بوو. This romance, or the Romance languages, were very related to the aristocratic class, or the bourgeoisie class. But the words were so simple and beautiful that it was the language of the nation. People spoke in it. It's not, of course it was related to the aristocrats, but not necessarily completely related to the aristocrats, because people spoke in these languages. And so these are the two opinions you have to know. It's also good to know the meaning of what, Rebazi Romanticism is, understanding it in general, and we can move on to the second part. Sardami Derkautni Rebazi Romanticism, the generation of when the literary movement of Romanticism appeared. Rebazi Romanticism la Europa seri halda. The Romance movement started in Europe. But not everywhere in Europe at the same time. First, now we're going to get a name. This name is important. You have to memorize it. Friedrich Schlegel. This guy is related to Germany, so just relate Friedrich to Germany. Friedrich Schlegel, Almani Romanticism وەک ڕێبازیەکی ئەدەبی دژ بە کلاسیزم پەیڕەو کرد. Friedrich Schlegel established the Romanticism literary movement in Germany as a literary movement against classical. And that was, the first guy, Friedrich Schlegel, started it in Germany. And then we have Madame de Staël, لەژێر کاریگەری شلیگلدا لە فەڕەنسا بانگەشەی بۆ کرد. Madame de Staël was affected by Frederick in Germany, so she started and did the same thing, except she did it in France. And so now we're going to get a year. ماوەی 1800 بۆ 1830 بە ماوەی خۆگرتن و پەرەسەندنی ئەو ڕێبازە لە فەڕەنسا دادەنرێت. The era between 1800 to 1830 CE, or after death, is called to that. It's used to describe that time of establishing this literary movement in France. It also lines up with the Victorian era. And so Victor Hugo ڕۆڵی سەرەکی لە چەسپاندنی ئەم ڕێبازە لە فەڕەنسادا هەبوو. For France we have two names, Madame de Staël and then Victor Hugo. ڕۆڵی سەرەکی, what was Victor's role in this movement? In the year 1827, شانۆنامەی کرۆمۆیلی بڵاو کردەوە. ئەم شانۆنامەیە بە پەیامنامەی ڕۆمانسیزم دادنرێت. In the year 1827, he wrote a play by the name of Kromoil. He published this play, and this play served as the beyanname romanticism. Beyannama is basically like manifesto. It kind of acted as the manifesto of romanticism at the time. That's how influential Victor Hugo was to the romanticism movement. And so it's very important to know these names, it's important to know the years, and it's, you know, it's very general, like it's something very beautiful, like everybody should know this. And so تایبەتمەندیەکانی ڕێبازی romanticism, these are very important. These are the characteristics of the Romance movement. لەبەرەوەی romanticism دژی دەستوری دەسەپاوی classicism, because it was a movement against classical. ئەگەر تایبەتمەندیەکانی classicism هەڵبگیرێ ئەوە تایبەتمەندیەکانی romanticism. So because it was a movement directly opposite to classical, pretty much get whatever you have that is classical, opposite, make it opposite, like do the exact opposite thing, that's, you have romanticism. Number one, the salati aql balawa danet. Baik bazakani has to soz dadat, lajati meshk. The kata sarchawi surushu has to be wijdan. When we think of classical, we think of, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Communist Manifesto, you know, Plato, Aristotle. These are all classical guys. And so, when you look at classical, they use the brain a lot, but romanticism does lati aql balawa daniyat, meaning it removes the, you know, the dominance of the brain, and it suits itself with freeing the feelings. And so it gives a more direct approach to feelings rather than the brain. Romanticism گەڕانەوەیە بۆ باوەشی سروشتی کپ و هێمن. شاعیر بە سروشدا هەڵدەدات و حەز دەکات بە گۆشەگیری تێکەڵی سروش ببێت و لە باوەشی سروشدا ڕابمێنێت. جەمی ئەندێشەی بەردەدات. شاعیر بە سروشدا romanticism gives a big importance to returning to nature, to returning to beautiful, peaceful nature. And شاعیر بە سروشدا هەڵدەدات و حەز دەکات بە گۆشەگیری تێکەڵ سروش بێت. And these poets, these romanticism poets, like want to be in nature. They want to mix nature. They want to be in like, you know, inside of the beautiful, peaceful nature, and rather than, you know, the you know, the progressiveness or the movement of like humans towards you know, big cities and whatever, or like towards that technological advancement, because they give a bigger importance to peaceful nature. So understand, like these green parts, I suggest you memorize. Romanticism لدربني has to sozu جوشی ناودا باوری با آزادی هەیە گوێ بە هیچ دەستور و قالبێکی چەسپاو نادات. It does not believe in borders. Romanticism, there's no direct border in romanticism. There's no direct rule you gotta follow. Like شعري حر, free poems. It was basically all about freedom. So romanticism لدربريني has to soz جوجي ناودا. So it gives a bigger importance to freedom, and it doesn't like to be, you know, forced into anything. Romanticism بايخ بتاكي مني شاعر تاكي كنوية تايبتي تدات. Romanticism gives a big importance to the personal me. You know, if I write a romanticism poem, it's going to be about me. It's going to be about what I like. It's going to be about who I like. But if you look at, you know, old classical, you're going to see it's all about the general us or you or whoever. So this gives a bigger importance, you know, because it's about freeing your feelings. At the same time, it's about your heart, your own heart, not anybody else's heart. And so here we continue. رومانسیزم لە بایەخدا بە کات و شوێندا تووشی نامۆیی دەبێت لەگەڵ سەردەم و شوێنی خۆی ناگونجێت بە خەیاڵ بە ڕابردوو دەگەڕێتەوە خەم بۆ سادە خۆشەکانی ڕابردوو دەخوات بۆ ڕزگاربوونیشی لە شار و شوێنی خۆیەتی بەرەو سروشت ڕادەکات. This is very beautiful. رومانسیزم لە بایەخدا بە کات و شوێندا تووشی نامۆیی دەبێت. It becomes very confusing, or it becomes very you know, conflicted when it comes to, you know, the time and place. Because it returns to the past in the mind of the poet or the mind of the writer. It returns to the past, you know, recalling all the good times. At the same time, you know, like they feel uneasy in their own place. They want to go back, you know. If you look at classical, it's all about the future, the future. Or like what we should do, how we should do it. But romanticism does not care about that. It pertains more to the past, and it likes the past more in the sense that I did this. I remember I was with this person. I remember I was in this place. And that's the conflictedness of the romance movement. رومانسیزمیەکان هیوە و ئاواتیان زۆر بوو بەڵام توانای بەدیهێنانی ئەو ئاواتیان نەبوو. Romance writers always have big creative brains, but they don't have any means to achieve the things that they think of. Like, a lot of these things that romance poets or romance writers describe are often very imaginary, are often very idealistic and not realistic. So this just describes how romance writers have a lot of hopes. هیوا و ئاواتیان زۆر بوو، بەڵام توانای بەدیهێنانی ئەو ئاواتانیان نەبوو. بەدیهێنان meaning achieve. They had a lot of hopes, but they didn't have many means to achieve these hopes. لای ڕۆمانسیزمیەکان ئەدەب بە گشتی و شعر بە تایبەتی لاساییکردنی سروشت و ژیانە. بگرە داهێنانە. ئەمرازی داهێنانیش لەلایەنی ئەندێشە داهێنەرانەیە. ڕۆمانسیزم ئەدەب بوو بە گشتی و شعر بە تایبەت لاساییکردنەوەی سروشت و ژیانە. The romance writers describe, writing and poetry, especially poetry, as copying nature, as, redoing what nature is already doing. ڕۆمانسیزمی ئەوروپی هەموو شتێکیان دەکردە بابەتی نووسین. European romanticism made everything into a topic of, writing. They made everything into a poem. Like, they see something on the street, they write a poem about it. That's a characteristic of romance. Romanticism لە دەربڕیندا پەنا دەباتە بەر هەندێ سیمای تایبەتی وەک ڕزگاربوون لە دەستور و یاسا، ئاڵۆزی، تێکەڵکردنی هەستەکان. Romanticism has sometimes leans towards specific, images, like being free from rules and regulations. ئاڵۆزی meaning confusion or uncertainty. تێکەڵکردنی هەستەکان the mixing of feelings. بەناو یەکداچوونی ئەرکی هونەرە جوانەکان. This is more pertaining to arts. ڕەچاوکردنی لایەنی خودی و لیریکی. Or basically in general, they have certain topics that they go towards. I don't think that, for example, in the exam, I don't think he's going to ask for all 9 characteristics, but it's good to first, 4 characteristics and, whatever you can understand from these and to turn it into a specific rule. But these are all in general very mixed in together. So don't get too confused about them. Okay, now romanticism لأدبي كرديدا. Romanticism in Kurdish literature. Let's get started. Alright, this video is starting to get long, so I hope nobody's sleeping. If I get too slow, just increase the speed in the YouTube player. But we're gonna get started. Romanticism لأدبي كرديدا. Romance in Kurdish literature. Romanticism لأدبي كرديدا زيادة للشعر دا دردكيوت نكلا بخشان. There's 2 types of Kurdish literature, شعر and pakhshan. شعر pertains more to poems, pertains exactly to poems. Pakhshan is mostly essays, paragraphs, written, like mostly pertains to that type of literature. And here it says romanticism in Kurdish literature appears more in شعر, in poems. هەندێک بابەت ڕەگەزی ڕۆمانسیزم بەر لە سەدەی 20م لە شێعرەکانی بێسارانی و مەولەوی حاجی قادر و شاعرانی دیکەش دەبینرێت. Before the 20th century, before the 20th century, the characteristics and the way of the Romance movement was apparent in the poems of 3 poets, Besarani, Mawlawi, and Haji Qadir. But this was still niche, underground, like before the 20th century. But when did it start? Like, when did the trend start picking up? In the first half of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, especially in the periods between the First and the Second World Wars, that's when it really picked up, the Romance movement in the Kurdish and Kurdistan. شعری نەتەوە دراوسەکان بە تایبەتی شعری نوێی تورکی لە سەردەمدا کاریگەری زۆری کردە سەر ئەو جوڵانە تازەی ئەدەبی کوردی کە لە گەڵاڵەبووندا بوو. شعری نەتەوە دراوسەکان, the poems of neighboring countries at the time, especially the new Turkish literature of the time, or the new Turkish poems of the time, they had a big effect on the Kurdish Romance movement, which was still in its early stages. Here is described as galalabun, like flowering stages. Shari Europish, this is not very important, so we're just gonna go down because we're kind of like thirsty for time right now. بنامەکانی شاری ڕۆمانسیزمی کوردی. The foundations of Kurdish literature. Characteristics and foundations of Kurdish literature. پشتکردنە کێشی عروز و کە شێعری کلاسیزمی کوردی پێوە نووسراوە گەڕانەوە بۆ کێشی پەنجەی خۆماڵی کە کێشێکی ڕەسەنی کوردیە و لەسەر بنەمای ژمارەی بڕگەیی. هەموو شێعری فۆلکلۆری کوردی و زۆربەی شێعری نزاری گۆران و لوور بەو کێشە نووسراون. First we have kesh, which is the weight of the poem. You know how sometimes they say it could also mean prose, you know. So back then there was, still, there's multiple ways of writing a poem. Sometimes you want to write it, it's mostly pertaining to the number of syllables or how you use your syllables. That's called kesh, or the weight of the poem. The weight of the poem used to be in classical a type of weight called aruzi Arabi, which the Arabs used, aruz. But then it returned to Panjay Khomali, which is counting the syllables with your fingers to create a very much nicer sounding, in my opinion, poem. Most of the old folklore Kurdish poems were written using Panjay Khomali, and this was basically just bringing it back because of the effect that Arabic aruz had on, Kurdish poems. Then we have sarwa, weight, and I forgot the other word, but the end of the poem. Okay, so I just confirmed, and yeah, it's the kesh and sarwa is called meter and rhyme. And so the meter that they used in the beginning for kesh was aruzi Arabi in in classical, and then they made it into the Panjay Khomali meter. And then for sarwa, or the rhyme, وازهنان ليكتي سروا وبكارهناني جود سروا. Back then, the rhyme of the poem were yakati sarwa, meaning all of them were the same. For example, if you read any classical poem, you see like all of the the ends of the lines ending in the same letter or ending in the same sound or ending in the same syllable. They removed that and it started wazhenan liyakati sarwa bakarhenai jud sarwa. They used jud sarwa, meaning two sound alike, then two sound alike, then two sound alike. That's one of the calling cards of Kurdish Romanticism. And then that's first rhyme, then meter, and then yekati babat للشعر الرومانسيزي وسر همو شركان دابش دبيت همو دياركان يكتي بتويل لنيودا. Yeah, and so one of the things that established itself in Kurdish Romanticism was yekati babat, meaning the entire poem goes about the same topic, and that's literally the unity of the topic of the poem. And then we move on to the second part, which is the fourth khal, or the fourth point, bakarhenani zmaniki sadu asan, using simple and easy to understand language. This is a very important calling card and may come back in the exam. For example, it's going to ask you, what is binamakani romanticism la Kurdida, or what is the foundations of romanticism in Kurdish? You're going to say the words are easy to understand and they're simple. You're going to say that it used yakati babat. You're going to say that it used Panjay Khomali for the meter or for the kesh. You're going to say for sarwa it used Jud sarwa, I think, yeah. Bakarhenani Jud sarwa wazhena liyakati sarwa. Like, these are things that are going to be asked of you. And so then sha'ir bapi, the point right after the easy language, sha'ir bapi tuanai khoy lahun huna rnawan beji bawakan ladadat badwai lek chwandin و خوازه هنری چوانکاری نوێ دادەگەڕێت. ڕەوانبێژی تازە ڕەوانبێژی باوەکان لا دەدات. ڕەوانبێژی, I don't think there's a direct way to translate it into English, so know that ئەدەبی رۆمانسیزم لایدا, meaning it turned away from classical ڕەوانبێژی and created a new type of its ڕەوانبێژی. گەڕانەوە بۆ سروشت, the sixth point, returning back to nature. We discussed that in the other parts too. خۆشەویستیەکی پاک و بێگەرد زۆر جاریش ناومێدی لە خۆشەویستی و this goes upon the love, how romance writers had a very nice or like a very beautiful kind of expressing their love, and a lot of the times being hopeful of their love. That's a characteristic or a calling card of what we'd call romance. باسكرني درد وآزاري تايبت. The eighth is talking about specific hurt, my own hurt, what has happened in my heart. That's another calling card. The past becomes a very wide and very open topic. That's the calling card of romanticism. So these are kind of like the same point, 8 and 9. Hadukan, both of them are talking about, old hurt. So you can, mix them. The teacher told us to do so. But that's really all we have for that Bashi Adab. And now we're going to move on to Sha'irs. But yeah, now we're going to move on to Numune Sha'ri Romansiz Kurdi, which I'm going to put in a separate video. I'm going to make it a two-part because this is getting too long, and I hope everybody benefited from this. I hope we all get good grades.